absolutely no one was safe when it came to the pursuit of absolute power, especially when the one chasing it was Stalin.
Behind the walls of the Kremlin in Moscow ruled a ruthless and bloodthirsty despot. Over a quarter of a century in power, he perfected the art of rule by terror. Forced labor, mass starvation, assassination. These were his political tools. 20 million Soviet citizens were killed by Joseph Stalin's brutal regime.
Stalin was distinguished by regarding death as the ultimate political tool. All the Bolsheviks believed it, Lenin had believed it, and Trotsky had believed it too. But Stalin took it to new levels.
This program charts the wave of terror that engulfed the Soviet people during Stalin's rule. A terror personally and routinely orchestrated by Stalin. Many thousands of death warrants bearing his own signature. In a century that witnessed great evil, Stalin was, perhaps, the greatest of all dictators. In 1924, the Soviet people went into mourning for Lenin, the man who had established the communist dictatorship in Russia. Just 7 years after the Bolsheviks seized power, the leaders of the revolution had to choose someone to take Lenin's place. As Lenin lay in state, an intense struggle for power followed between his political heirs.
Stalin invented the Lenin myth. He immediately grasped that Lenin could be the god of this new Bolshevik regime. And it was he who insisted that Lenin be embalmed, he that insisted that the mausoleum be created, and to sanctify Lenin's word, and it was he that would decide what Lenin had said, and when, and what it meant.
Stalin intended to inherit that myth, but Lenin's final message to the comrades was critical of Stalin and praised his greatest rival for Lenin's throne, Leon Trotsky.
The choice was simple. Who was supposed to lead, Stalin or Trotsky? The majority were afraid of Trotsky and his extremely radical ideas, so they chose what they believed to be the lesser of two evils.
The party congress made a decision they would live to regret. They ignored Lenin's will, and instead of throwing Stalin out, the comrades promoted him. Stalin had won his first victory. At the funeral of Felix Dzerzhinsky, the first head of the Soviet Secret Service, the leadership power struggle was close to its resolution, and the two rivals, Trotsky and Stalin, were filmed together for the last time.
They were all pretty straightforward people, all except Stalin, that is. He was false and spineless. He always behaved like a sly grand vizier.
The power struggle between Stalin and Trotsky ended in 1927. Stalin was quick to humiliate his defeated rival. Trotsky was arrested, shackled, and deported.
After that, Stalin used the name Trotsky as a synonym for all sorts of treachery. His wholesale labeling of the Trotskyists as enemies of the state detracted from Stalin's own responsibility for the country's economic woes, for the numerous accidents in the factories, and for his own disorganized politics. But Trotskyists provided the perfect scapegoats.
With Trotsky gone, Stalin was free to pursue his own agenda, and the tyranny began. Those who opposed him were muzzled. No one dared to criticize him openly anymore. He was turning the one-party state into a one-man dictatorship. With his first 5-year plan, he began to force his own will upon the Soviet people. The Soviet juggernaut was born in a vast program of industrial development. Many Soviet citizens not only tolerated Stalin's revolution from above, but they supported it with enthusiasm. But few of them sensed the real paranoid personality that was hiding behind the mask of the benevolent father figure.
War ein begabter Schauspieler und Intrigant ohne
He was a gifted actor and schemer. Concepts such as honor, conscience, human rights, humanity were all totally alien to him.
Die waren ihm glatt unbekannt.
Stalin was persuading the Soviet people to love him, but soon he would turn his attention to his self-declared enemies, the farmers and the church, and destroy them. Joseph Stalin's new slogan was, "No more God 5 years from now." For centuries, the Russian people had worshipped their church and its icons. Stalin's communism couldn't tolerate such competition.
Marxism was a universalist, rationalist, secular religion in a way, and there was no room for two religions in Russia. Lenin had often said, destroy as many priests as you can. Stalin continued that work, and they pretty methodically destroyed the priesthood.
The people followed the leader's word. Religious symbols and icons were destroyed in their millions. The terror spread to the priests themselves.
They chopped off the heads of the priests and let them freeze to death in the ice. They were thrown into jail, shot, buried alive, or executed outside of Moscow by the hundreds or by the thousands. There are numerous killing fields out there, littered with the bones of the Russian clergy.
But Stalin's toughest campaign at this time was to rid the countryside of its small private farms and farmers. At the beginning of the 1930s, Russia was an underdeveloped country. Nowhere else had the pre-revolutionary lifestyle been better preserved than in the villages. Products from the small farms and workshops were sold or swapped in local markets, forming the backbone of day-to-day survival. In 1930, with a stroke of his pen, Stalin confiscated all privately owned land and centuries of tradition came to an end. He took away the livelihood of 4/5 of the population. It was the first of a series of crimes against his own people.
All that belonged to our farm had to be surrendered. We were not allowed to keep anything. The order was given that everything belonged to the commune. I don't know what drove Stalin to issue such an order. He destroyed human beings.
Stalin's collectivization of the farms followed a cynical logic. Industrialization was the priority, and huge new collective farms would provide enough food for the rapidly expanding urban populations. After all, he claimed, most farms were inefficient and so tiny that not even a chicken could run free. But the farmers fought back. They refused to deliver their harvest. Without hesitation, Stalin, from his Kremlin power base, ordered a full-scale assault on the rural population. The secret police were ordered to sweep the countryside, tracking down all supplies that had been kept back by the farmers and to seize them all. To do this, Stalin needed an army of fanatical young supporters.
We were sent off. They gave us a few horses, a carriage, or in winter, a sleigh. Then we went to the villages and systematically searched all the farms and houses, one by one.
The requisitioning committee just came in and took everything away. It was impossible to hide anything from them. They took everything apart and searched every nook and cranny.
We got a paper from the local Soviet. detailing exactly how much grain we were to deliver.
Причитается столько-то, допустим, сдать зерна.
My mother kept a small bag of flour, and they even took that away from her. We were literally robbed blind. Mother fell on her knees, imploring them, shouting and crying that the children needed something to eat. Not one of them cared. Not one was touched in any way on a human level. And so began a slowly creeping death for us children.
These officials became Stalin's willing executioners.
Приказ Сталина
We considered Stalin's orders to be law,
это и закон.
ironclad law. We believed in him,
Верили у его,
and so we carried out his orders.
выполняли его приказы.
But depriving the peasants of their food and their livelihood was not enough for Stalin.
A new slogan was handed out. In the course of collectivization, the kulaks have to be destroyed as a social class.
The propaganda labeled the prosperous landed peasants, known as kulaks, as enemies of the people, because Stalin considered them his enemies. Hundreds of thousands of kulaks were deported to Siberia on the orders of Stalin.
My father always used to return home late from work, but still I waited for him every night so he could tell me a story. One night, there was a knock on the door. They were secret agents from the NKVD. And while my father was telling me my bedtime story, they turned the whole house upside down. Then they arrested my father. And as they led him out of the house, he called to me, "I will be back. I am innocent after all. And then I will finish the story." I am still waiting. I'm still waiting today.
It was the forced collectivization of the farms that gave birth to the age of the Gulag. Solovetsky, an island in the White Sea, was the mother of all camps, the seed of the giant Gulag archipelago. Since 1932, opponents of the Soviet regime were brought here. This Soviet concentration camp was called an institution for re-education.
The origin of the camp system in the Soviet Union was rather like the camp system that existed under the Tsarist regime. It took political dissidents and opponents and so on, and it put them in basic concentration camps where they would be exiled away and no longer a threat to the system, where in some cases it might be possible to re-educate them, that was an idea as well, into what communism offered.
In those days, the emphasis was on correcting or improving the convict so that he, upon his release, would become an all-around Soviet citizen, working and shouting, "Hail Stalin," and so on. Later on, in the 30s, after the collectivization, the emphasis shifted to Soviet society taking revenge on the delinquents.
Those who were identified as enemies of communism were taken away to the labor camps and forced to work for the state. In the bitter cold and with starvation rations, their work fueled the country's rapid industrialization.
The Soviet system under Stalin was predicated absolutely on the idea that no single individual could really hold up the course of historical progress, that history was moving inexorably, so communists argued, towards the creation of some kind of communist paradise, and that any individual who obstructed that, got in the way, for whatever reason, was dispensable.
New camps sprung up everywhere. They were wherever convict labor was required in massive amounts. The enormous pool of human beings at his disposal tempted Stalin to tackle ever new, ever more grandiose projects, and forced labor always meant grinding manual work. Camp orchestras dictated the rhythm of the work, with horns and drums, beating time for hammers and spades.
Man gets used to anything. That's a fact. Getting used to it is part of the principle. Even if you have never held a shovel before in your life, you grab it, and you get used to do what you are forced to do. Of course, it happened that some of them croaked, sure, but that's life.
The White Sea-Baltic Ship Canal was built in the record time of 19 months. But the whole project was misconceived. It was too shallow and froze over half the time. Conceived in haste, born blind, wrote Alexander Solzhenitsyn. The mere whim of Stalin had cost the lives of 150,000 human beings.
Yes, this canal project was the idea of our leader. Truly, a grand idea. But maybe the job was too tough for some of the workers.
Stalin hated public appearances, yet he agreed to open this canal because it helped build the myth of the Stalin miracle. The dictator left others to deal with the murderous reality of his wishes, such as this man by his side, Janarik Yagoda, the notorious head of the political police then called the NKVD. He was in charge of procuring the slave labor. The government plan determined how many laborers would be needed, and that plan came from Stalin. By the mid-1930s, 10 million forced laborers were working for Stalin.
Little human lives didn't matter to the Bolsheviks. They were happy to kill people in massive reprisals, they were happy to deport millions of people, they were happy to execute millions of people, and they were happy to send millions of people. 18 million in this regime went through the camps. They sent them out there. They had an economic value. They could work in the camps. They could build canals. They could mine coal and gold and salt. But the important thing was they were removed from society, and if they died, it didn't matter, because they were a small price to pay for perfection.
As Stalin strove for his idea of socialist perfection, the countryside fell silent. Villages like these lost their struggle for survival. Even those who were not forced to slave in the Gulag were now close to starvation. There was method behind Stalin's apparent madness. Whatever food was available was distributed to the factory workers. The rural population was simply left to starve to death.
I recall very precisely. Our neighbor, an old woman, came to my mother and lamented. No bread on the table, but Stalin on the wall.
The people of the Ukraine suffered particularly badly because they resisted the collectivization more persistently than anybody else.
One day, the neighbors noticed that my mother gave a piece of beetroot to us healthy children, but not to my sick brother. The poor little guy climbed down from the stove with his last ounce of strength, because he was hungry too, naturally, and also wanted a piece. Our neighbor said, "Go ahead, give him something." But my mother replied, "No, I have to save my healthy children at least." My brother started to weep bitterly and returned to his sleeping place on top of the stove. A short time later, he died. When the undertaker came, he pulled my brother from the stove and put him on the hearse. And then he grabbed my mother and laid her next to my dead brother, although she was still alive. I started to cry, but the undertaker only said, "Shut up. You want me to come again tomorrow? She's barely breathing."
Since people could only save their lives by escaping, Stalin had the roads blocked and rail travel suspended. Millions of Ukrainians were trapped, imprisoned in their own villages. Following the first year of famine, life became even more unbearable by 1933.
One day, a classmate was absent. After a few days, our teacher suggested that we started looking for him. When we ran into his neighbors, they warned us not to go into the house. Something horrible had happened to him. He had been killed by his own parents, who had gone mad from hunger, and they had cut him into pieces, pickled him in a barrel, and had started to eat him.
While millions were starving to death in the Ukraine, Stalin exported 5 million tons of grain. Now the kulaks were a broken force, the dictator would start a new phase of persecution. No one would be safe from Stalin and his murderous henchmen. This is the other Soviet Union. The Soviet Union for those with the right opinion. The Soviet Union for the new elite of party comrades. For these people, there were plenty of rewards. Official cars, pleasure trips, a lively nightlife. There was no doubt in their minds whom they had to thank for that.
Поднять бокалы за великого Сталина, который ведет нас по светлой дороге к коммунизму.
In January 1934, the dictator convened what was called the Party Congress of the Victorious. Stalin, the ingenious man of steel, as he was now called, was proud of his achievements and had himself celebrated with enthusiasm. But the delegates also applauded another person, Sergei Kirov, head of party organization in Leningrad.
Der Name Kirov.
The name Kirov was firmly entrenched in the public mind. He was, in a way, the man that all their hopes were focused on, whether it was party members or the great working masses, and not only in Leningrad.
Sergei Kirov was Stalin's easygoing favorite, a man always singing opera as he walked around the corridors of power.
After the mania of industrialization and the madness of collectivization, Kirov was the one who carried the hopes for a softer kind of communism. He was elected into the Central Committee by a wide margin.
Some leaders approached Kirov, who was the boss of the Leningrad Party, and said that he should replace Stalin as Soviet leader. When Stalin heard about this, he immediately began to regard Kirov as a potential enemy.
Even though Kirov refused to go along with the plot, Stalin found out about it, and Kirov became a marked man. It became a custom to shower the great leader with gifts, a ritual to demonstrate allegiance. Someone gave Stalin a rifle. In jest, he pointed it at the members of the Central Committee. 3 years later, few of them would still be alive. On the 1st of December 1934, at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Sergei Kirov prepared to leave a party meeting in Smolny, his official residence. At the same time, the assassin Dmitry Nikolaev sneaked through a side entrance into Kirov's office. At 3 minutes past 4, the two men met. 3 shots were fired, and Kirov was dead. Stalin rushed to Leningrad to head the investigation. After a private conversation with Nikolaev in jail, Stalin simply declared the murder to have been a Trotskyist plot. An easy scapegoat, Nikolaev was then liquidated.
So the importance of the assassination of Kirov is not really who ordered it and why they ordered it, because we'll never know that. That's the great mystery. But what's important is that it enabled Stalin to create the environment to destroy all his political enemies, to destroy vast parts of the Bolshevik party, and to kill and take vengeance on anyone who'd crossed him throughout his life. The result was the Great Terror.
From now on, murder became a routine means of government politics. To mask this crude form of political violence, Stalin invented the show trial. The state, Stalin, was represented by Andrei Vyshinsky.
Вся наша страна от малого до старого ждет и требует одного: изменников и шпионов, продавших врагу нашу родину, расстрелять как поганых псов.
By early 1937, fear had paralyzed the government of this giant empire. But then the terror spread from the party to the people.
Hysteria was provoked. The so-called spy mania, the fear of spies that they said infiltrated the state at every level.
Смерть этим врагам, смерть этим паразитам. Вот какой наш должен быть протест этим врагам.
With this line of argument, masses of people could be arrested and incarcerated with no problems.
Stalin unleashed an unprecedented manhunt. If you couldn't identify a spy, you became a suspect yourself. Your duty as a citizen was to denounce the enemies of the state.
Informers were everywhere in those days. For example, there were the building supervisors recruited by the NKVD, and they were told to name 5 people from their block. If they could only give them 4 names, they themselves became number 5.
It was sufficient if somebody heard you tell a joke, or someone was just out for revenge. So he denounced the other person as unreliable, and the person was arrested immediately. But they also took the informer. It was like the plague, spreading all over the country. A general plague of terror.
Terror became a routine part of government. The secret police would come every night at the same time, 4 a.m.
Being arrested was a relief. There was no need to tremble anymore. It was done. It was over.
This is Lubyanka, the secret police headquarters and center of government terror. Reasons for arresting people were invented, then they were brought in and confessions were beaten out of them.
That was the way the NKVD worked. First you're being locked up, and then they would always find a legal pretext. And if the law didn't exactly fit, they would squeeze your fingers in the door, knock out a few of your teeth. Most of the time that would make you sign.
Yes, that happened quite a lot. If somebody didn't make the right statement, we would beat it out of him. Under physical pressure, he would confess crimes that he'd never committed. You have to understand, I am an interrogator. I can't put my arm around your shoulder, compliment you, or have a nice chat. No, I've got to get everything out of you that you're being accused of.
I told the interrogator, listen, I've done nothing, absolutely nothing. And he just answered tersely, I know, but it's cheaper for us to lock you up than to keep you under surveillance. Literally, that's what he said.
Вот это были его буквальные слова.
Stalin made regular use of his private box at the Bolshoi. Tchaikovsky was his favorite. But after the music ended, he returned to his other passion. At his desk, he signed death warrants, often several thousand in a single night. And occasionally he would consider a list too short and would make a note in the margin, 6,000 more, no matter who. These mass graves are witnesses to the horror that was executed. They exist all over the Soviet Union, like here in Kiev. Between 1937 and 1939, more than 1.5 million people were liquidated. The Great Terror was a meticulously organized mass extermination. Even the smallest village had to meet its quota.
Just like the production quota for timber, the quota for extermination was overfulfilled, especially among the country's elite. That was absolutely typical for Stalin's type of terror.
One man became the symbol of the terror, the People's Commissar, Nikolai Yezhov.
Yezhov was Stalin's ultimate henchman in the terror. He was Stalin's poison dwarf, tiny, quite handsome, blue-eyed, black hair. He'd been perfectly normal communist operative until Stalin gave him the job of being secret police chief in 1936. He then entered into this job in a frenzy of killing.
Yezhov boasted, "Leave anybody to me for a night, and I will get him to confess that he is the King of England."
On one occasion, for example, he turned up at a cabinet meeting in the Kremlin in his usual white uniform with white sleeves. And Khrushchev said to him, "Why have you got mess all over your shirt sleeves? What's all that?" And he held it up and he said, "I'm very proud to say I've been torturing enemies of the people all night in Lubyanka. And this is the blood of an enemy of the people."
Yezhov also controlled the next stage of Stalin's terror. After the arrest and interrogation, the deportation to the Gulag in cattle trucks under inhuman conditions.
28 people were squeezed into each cattle car. We got nothing to drink, but we got salted fish. We were stupid enough to eat that because we couldn't imagine that they'd let us die with thirst. And we didn't have a toilet either.
Thousands of prisoners were transported to the camps each day from across the entire Soviet Union. Pyotr Demant traveled on the so-called death route. After 3 months and 7,000 miles, his cattle truck reached the easternmost corner of the vast empire.
Eventually, we were unloaded in Nakodka. Nakodka, that is 26 kilometers after Vladivostok, the terminal of the Trans-Siberian Railway. That's where we got out of the railroad cars. We stumbled and crawled, or rather fell out of the train. And of course we were surrounded by armed guards who searched each and every car, so nobody could hide. And then they send the whole transport off.
At the labor camp, new horrors awaited them.
As far as the extermination of human beings through labor was concerned, the administration of each camp and of the entire camp system was organized in an incredibly efficient way, like clockwork. The Gulag was a slavery institution like no other. Yes, that's the way it was. And you have to understand my position. I couldn't just say no and dodge the system.
But Buldayev managed to draw pictures of what happened there. He became the secret chronicler of the Gulag's universe of horror. These are the only authentic pictures from inside the Gulag.
It was a cannibalistic system, literally. It devoured human beings. The life of the individual was worth nothing. Absolutely nothing. The whole system was built on nothing but violence, blood, and a mountain of corpses.
The victims of the Great Terror were sent to the most hostile parts of Siberia. The prison camp that Lev Ratskon was sent to was forced to work in the forest.
In the autumn of 1938, in October to be precise, we were 517 men. And in the spring of 1939, in the course of a single winter that is, we were reduced to 22.
It became a standard expression in the camps to say, if the great Stalin only knew. Thousands wrote letters from the Gulag to the leader in Moscow.
All our hope rested on Stalin. We really believed that all this happened without his knowledge. We were firmly convinced that he was a saint, the most holy one, the only one who could possibly save us. We all revered him and worshipped him like a god. Yes, we believed Stalin was the Almighty.
Some of the victims of Stalin's reign of terror were sent to one of the most inhospitable places on Earth, close to the polar circle. In this rocky, treeless, snowy desert, millions of convicts had to dig for gold in the mines of Kolyma.
It is a blood-curdling word. Like nothing else, it stands for suffering, misery, death, and human tragedy.
Nothing says more about the character of a nation than its prisons, wrote Leo Tolstoy in an earlier age.
They always transported as many prisoners to Kolyma as they needed. 100% of what the camp commanders requested was delivered every year. For that reason, they did not mind masses of people freezing to death, or starving to death, or dying in other ways. They knew those who died were replaced.
As soon as they arrived at the camp, the prisoners were allocated to the various gold mines. The working conditions were tough, 10 hours underground. The quotas were beyond human endurance, 100 carts of rock per shift, per prisoner.
If you stayed well below your quota, that is, if you delivered only 70, 80, 40, 50 carts per day, you were not allowed to return to the camp. You received 200 grams of bread, the punishment ration, plus half a herring, and then came the next shift, the night shift, and you were assigned to the night shift.
Und dann kommt die nächste Schicht, die Abendschicht heraus, und du wirst wieder...
And if you did not come up with your carts again, you had to stay out again and had to work a third shift.
Das dritte Mal arbeiten.
Hundreds of thousands of prisoners lost their lives in Kolyma. They were buried in these cemeteries, close to the mines. There were few who managed to preserve their sanity. The poet Varlam Shalamov wrote, "We had neither pride nor self-respect, no human emotions such as love, friendship, or charity. We realized that death was no worse than life."
There was only one rule in camp. You croak today, and I stay, to stay alive and survive until tomorrow.
One victim pitted against another, an appalling brutality created by the system.
In the Gulag, the secret police systematically dehumanized the human being. Men were turned into beasts of burden, first by drudgery, then by starvation, and finally by torture. The principle of government at the time worked this way. 1 out of 5 people was in prison, and every other person was a prison guard. You understand? The entire Soviet Union was one big camp.
Stalin channeled more than 28 million slaves through the Gulag. The Soviet people now lived in constant fear. But the cult surrounding Stalin left him blameless for all this suffering. Most people continued to believe that Stalin had nothing to do with the terror. Stalin was now invincible, but there would always be new enemies to eliminate. At the end of 1939, the Great Terror in the Soviet Union came to an end, for the time being. But the purges continued. Day by day, thousands of alleged opponents of the regime were murdered, including, eventually, 30,000 army officers. But the dictator still had one account left to settle: Leon Trotsky. Stalin's long arm reached all the way to his exile in Mexico.
I remember Mercader as an athletic, friendly, cordial man. He played his role to perfection. Nobody believed him capable of planning an assassination.
In 1937, Raymond Mercader courted Sylvia Agalov, the sister of Trotsky's secretary. In 1939, the couple moved into Trotsky's neighborhood. Soon, Mercader became a welcome guest in Trotsky's house, as he was on the 20th of August, 1940. The security guards at the fortress-like Trotsky villa had no suspicions when Mercader showed up late in the afternoon.
He came under the pretense of bringing Trotsky an article to edit. He entered his office, took off his hat and his coat, and he approached Trotsky to hand him the text. As soon as Trotsky had sat down to study the article, Mercader pulled out an ice pick he'd been hiding under his coat, took a swing, and hit him on the head with all the force he could muster. Trotsky jumped up from his chair and started a struggle with Mercader, in the course of which he uttered a piercing cry that echoed through the house. We all rushed to the rescue, and when I entered the library, I saw grandfather lying on the floor, covered with blood.
By the next day, Trotsky was dead. Stalin's oldest enemy was now removed by this well-planned assassination by Mercader. But it was from his enemies within the Soviet Union that Stalin always felt most threatened.
Stalin was not scared of his enemies outside. What he really dreaded were those on the inside. Stalin always felt threatened only by his own people, who he deeply despised.
By 1945, Stalin had survived and won his epic struggle with Hitler. The savior of the fatherland was fated by his people. But instead of thanking his subjects for the pain and suffering they endured in the Second World War, Stalin was already planning a new terror against them. He couldn't afford to soften his control and relax his grip, so he rallied the people against a new enemy within the country.
His whole life, Stalin was waging some kind of campaign. First, he fought the kulaks, or the Trotskyists, or the supporters of Zinoviev, and then some other group of so-called enemies. That means there was always one group in the foreground that had to be destroyed. And so these people were arrested. After the war, there was a new campaign, this time against the Jews.
At the end of the war, America becomes the main enemy, and Israel is about to be founded. Stalin backs the creation of Israel, but when it turns out that Israel is going to be an American ally, not a Soviet ally, Stalin changes his tune. He becomes immensely suspicious of the connections between Israel, America, and the 6 or 7 million Jews in the Soviet Union.
The Jews became Stalin's next enemy within. Professors, artists, and intellectuals were hauled off to the Gulag in their thousands.
Stalin's attitude towards the Jews was conditioned entirely by his previous sense of what made somebody an enemy. He saw their distinct culture and religion as a challenge in some sense. So they were excluded not because they were Jews in a racial sense, but because Jewish identity was perceived as a political threat. to the development of the Soviet state.
By 1952, Stalin was in his mid-70s, no longer a fit and healthy man. His paranoid mind began to fear that the doctors who were treating him were conspiring to assassinate him. Most of these doctors were Jewish. Following his old strategy, Stalin stirred up a mass hysteria against these enemies of the state.
If Stalin had lived any longer, Molotov, Mikoyan, Voroshilov, and probably also Beria would have been the first to be arrested and liquidated. There were very clear indications for this to happen. And then it would have been someone else's turn. For Stalin was preparing an extensive purge.
But these leading members of the Politburo escaped their fate. On the 1st of March 1953, at his dacha, Stalin suffered a massive stroke. Within 36 hours, he was dead. The nation went into mourning, believing in the myth of the just and benevolent leader, not the architect of the terror.
When we learnt that Stalin had died, we were overcome with a sense of uncertainty. We asked ourselves, what will be next? There was no sense of relief or joy.
We were all very scared. We kept quiet, showed no feelings, no emotion, except sorrow. Yes, we believed they would exterminate us now. Stalin was dead, so we too had to die.
Stalin had pursued to their death 20 million of his own citizens. In an era of appalling dictators, he was probably the worst.
Essentially, we should remember Stalin as this man regarded himself as a sort of messiah, a man who regarded himself as a historical figure, and for whom killing and murder were absolutely part of his daily political routine. And yes, we must regard him as one of the great monsters of all time.
But the system of terror Stalin had built up would not survive his death for long. It took just 3 years for his political heirs to denounce his crimes. Stalin had transformed the Soviet Union into a superpower, but the Soviet people had to live with a legacy of fear and persecution for decades to come.
Stalin concludes at the earlier time of 8 o'clock next Saturday. Find out where to learn more about Joseph Stalin at channel4.com/history. Well, weddings can be stressful enough without the bride having second